Well, hi, Tim, and thanks for um, agreeing to dialogue, even though we've only spoken once before. Um, I feel a sense of um, kindred spirit in you, just energetically.
Yeah,
Um, so
it's a
I
pleasure.
am down here on you in country on the South Coast, and you are where? Canberra
I'm,
in.
yeah, I'm on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land in Canberra, just up the mountains from you.
Yeah, beautiful. And I know you said mountains are special to you, so I was wanting to open the conversation with inviting you to talk about a place that is meaningful to you. Um, so take it away.
Yeah, lovely. Well, it's winter here, of course, and next week I'm going up into the snowy mountains for a regular week up in the snow, and that's an area which is just so special to me, Ngarigu country up around towards Mount Kosciuszko. And there's something that I find just absolutely transcendent about that country. It in terms of it lifts you right out of yourself into something which is just so much bigger than us. There's a vastness to an expanse of mountains, which Australian mountains, of course, are not like one imagines mountains to be as these big, steep, rocky, um, vastly high places. Australian mountains are very gentle. And so when you're up in the high country, you can see these waves and waves of snow-covered hills, often with this deep blue sky above them. It's also home to just an extremely special ecosystem. It's quite a sparse ecosystem, but just full of incredible beauty. The snow gums, Eucalyptus pauciflora, I think are one of the most beautiful plants on the planet.
Mm.
They're smallish gum trees, which, as their bark peels, they reveal different colors. So often you'll see these trees which are purple and green and grey and browns, different browns and greens, and these reddish yellow flowers. And they're home to rosellas, which are beautiful coloured birds, and Australian ravens, which are such beautiful, cheeky, friendly animals.
Mm.
It's a just a special, special place that grounds me and lifts me into the bigger than human every time I go there.
You get such big skies too, don't you, when you're in the mountains? Just that feeling of expanse. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Um, I was going to share about a place here. We are living at the moment at Maria South Heads. And when we first started getting to know the South Coast, I felt drawn to the South Head main beach. There are these amazing rocks there that sometimes are just peeking out a little bit of the sand, depending on what the sand is doing, and sometimes are the whole beach and there's not much sand and they're very present. And the corner of the beach is a huge cliff face. So you feel very held
Mm.
by the land there, and there's quite a bit of ochre, which is neat along the cliffs. Um, but I've had a couple experiences there where we've gone after a big storm, and I'd only experienced it once before moving here, where there's water from the storm running off down the cliff face. So you hear this like kind of trickle cascade sound from the fresh water, and then you hear the sea waves lapping in. And there's something when I experienced that first in California some years ago, and my body went, that feels so special. It just like was an instant total grounding reset for me when I first experienced that. And I've experienced it a couple times at this beach now where I get both of those sounds, and the fresh water sort of merging with the saltwater energy feels quite special as well. So it's almost like the rocks are little reminders of the mountains that you can't see behind the cliffs, and they're bringing that energy back. So it's this it really special beach for me of this combination of different energies, the mountain, the sea, the fresh water, the salt water. So yeah,
Well,
yeah. Um, so I thought I'd just say a little bit about how we met, and then whatever you would like to share a little bit about your context for the conversation for folks who don't know you. But we met through a mutual acquaintance, Deb, and she met my husband because she was looking to practice Spanish speaking down here. And which they've done once. My Spanish is not as good as my husband's. He kept his up much better, and hers is really good. But because they had met that way through other mutual friends of ours here, um, he posted on Facebook about my book coming out and a bit about the work that we do. And she messaged him and said, "Oh my goodness, I need to meet your wife. I think we'd have a lot to talk about."
excellent.
Yeah, so she and I met, and then she said, "Oh my goodness, you need to meet some people I know," and you were the first person she mentioned. So yeah, so that's how I got connected with you. And when she said, "Oh, he wrote a book about green democracy," I thought, this sounds like a marvelous person. I'd like to learn more. Um, so yeah, so I haven't had the opportunity to read your book in the few weeks since I've found out about its existence, but I look forward to that. And I invite you to please talk a little bit about your context for folks, and then we'll dive into some conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I look forward to reading yours as well. This definitely sounds like from our conversation, there's a lot of interwoven kind of ideas and thinking behind it. Yeah, I know Deb from environmental and greens activism, mostly up here in Canberra. We, interestingly enough, became quite close a few years ago around a campaign that we both wanted to leap on to. Canberra is one of the few cities in Australia and one of the few in the world, really, that has very tight bans on outdoor advertising. And there were some proposals to relax those bans. And we were both standing up and saying, no, no, no. One of the most special things about this city is that you don't have billboard ads. Um,
Right.
and that's just so important for the fact that it's a city in the bush, but the fact that it's a city of public service as well as the capital city of Australia, and it's a city um, of people and nature and connection, rather than this constant bombardment of the capitalist impulse to consume, consume, consume.
Mm.
Um, and that's, yeah, I guess a bit of a broad introduction to me. I'm an environmental activist of 25, 30 years, as well as a musician and a writer. I've been involved in kind of change making at many, many different levels, from, nonviolent direct action campaigns, as working with Greenpeace for years, through to being a staffer for the Greens in federal parliament for years, through to doing very kind of grassrootsy connections with setting up grassroots sharing groups and little libraries and things like that. Um, and yeah, my book, Living Democracy, which came out coming up for 2 years ago now, is sort of an interweaving of these ideas to think about how change making needs to be systemic. It needs to actually confront this what I call an anti-ecological system, which has driven us to the edge of the cliff, if not over the edge of the cliff. In fact, I'm pretty strongly of the opinion that we are over the cliff. We're now in free fall, and that is an incredibly liberating place to be. Um, the subtitle of my book is An Ecological Manifesto for the End of the World as We Know It. And it's
Mm,
basically saying this could genuinely be the end of the world, but it doesn't have to be.
mm,
It does have to be is the end of the world as we know it. We now actually really urgently have to grapple with the fact that we're in multi-systems collapse,
yeah.
ecological collapse, economic collapse, social and democratic collapse. Our systems of governance are falling apart around our ears. That's amazing. That's an incredible opportunity for us actually to reinvent,
Mm,
to start cultivating, or
mm.
they're already being cultivated. All of these systems are all around us all the time. To build that into a new system.
It's shifting focus. So yeah, what I love the way you described that in the systems thinking, because what came to me was very much to have a conversation around systems, and I feel like we tend to often use it in a really negative way and singularize it. The system is this or the system did that, but systems uh, are broad and complex, and as certain systems are falling apart, other systems are rising. And for me, a lot of it is a dance of where I place my focus. Um, but I wanted to sort of ask you when you're doing this work and then you're writing a book like that, for me, my arc has been a lot of okay, seeing through the systems, and then in the justice space, I sort of grabbed into restorative justice and went, this feels better. I believe in this in my, early 20s, and I will be an activist around this. And then I do that for some number of years, barely somehow surviving and feeding myself and really embodying that struggle. And then start seeing like, oh, this isn't enough. This isn't going to do enough to change things. This is only sort of working around the edges, and that's all I feel like it's ever going to really do. Um, I got to keep digging. I got to keep going deeper. And it's been um it's been hard for me for a lot of moments of those awakenings and feeling like that emperor has no clothes moment of seeing through things, but then not necessarily having a path forward and
Mm.
just walking in a lot of unknown. Um, Stumbling and tripping and hitting things because I can't see what I'm going, I don't have a guide. Um, so yeah, I was curious for you to talk a little bit about your process, sort of leading you up to being able to vision and write a book like you did.
That's a huge question, and there's so much in what you just said that I want to dig into and respond to.
Yeah.
Um, my whole life, certainly adult life, has been a process of stumbling into things and working stuff out as I go along. And I think the place that I've come to, which gives me some comfort, is that I think that's all there is, actually. And that what we need to do is become comfortable in that discomfort. And
Mhm.
there's some tremendous work, particularly in the decolonial space,
Mhm.
um, that I've been reading recently. Um, Wonderful work by, I don't know if you've come across Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira. She particularly kind of writes very deliberately about this idea of needing to sit in the discomfort, that this space is uncomfortable. It needs to be uncomfortable. There isn't a clear guide and there isn't an answer. Like you said, there isn't one guide, there isn't one answer. We need to explore what happens, be able to sit in the discomfort, be willing to stumble around in the dark and, you know, light a few matches and find some spaces which are generative. Work out what these spaces are that are generative in the darkness so that we can grow what comes next. And I think in particular, what I think about that is in terms of kind of thinking of that systemically, um, what you said about feeling like what you were doing with restorative justice was kind of around the edges is dead right, isn't it? Because everything that we're doing is sort of around the edges, and the task is to work out how to make those edges the new reality, the new structure,
Mm.
in my opinion. Um, and the systemic thinking that really, really kind of created the spark for me as I was researching and writing the book was a friend pointed me to um, the the work around the idea of panarchy. I don't know if you've come across that, but yeah, the ecological conception that comes from ecological science, but the scientists who developed it very much kind of saw it as a social science as well as an ecological hard science.
Mm.
And their insight is that everything in the world, literally everything, from atoms through to star systems, probably through to the universe as a whole,
Mm.
and every living being goes through this same cycle of growth, conservation in that form,
Mm.
collapse out
Mm.
of that form, and rearrangement into some new form. Everything in the world goes through that same cycle, essentially.
I
And
have that in my book everywhere. In
yeah,
Indigenous Science, we say
yeah,
birth, life, death, rebirth. So the life is that phase where you're sort of holding it as it is, and then the death is the falling apart, and then somehow it rebirths and reforms, right?
exactly. And
Yeah.
the beautiful conception of panarchy is that everything does that at every scale and all over the place. And they're all interdependent. They're all interwoven. They're all connecting and they're all influencing each other all the time. And
Mhm.
so, what this means is most of the time, those systems aren't lining up in the same dynamic so that when one is kind of at the point of growth, others are at the point of collapse. When some are sitting at conservation, others are in rearrangement. And that gives systems a great stability. So most of the cells in my body are going through that process at different times. So my body can sustain itself as a system for an extended period of time.
Right.
The great inside of transformation from panarchy is that sometimes a whole lot of these processes are lining up at collapse and regeneration at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a moment of incredible danger and opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And and what happens next in the panarchy model when a whole lot of things are lining up at collapse together is what then grows. What happens next depends on the different things that are growing at that point and
Mm-hmm.
what the conditions for growth are. And so that's why I see this moment when we're over the cliff as this opportunity for regeneration and regrowth. And that our task, really, more than anything else, is not to kind of think about what the system is going to be next or what the systems are. It's not to kind of work out what's happening there.
Mm-hmm.
It's to focus on what's happening here.
Right.
It's to put all of our energies into
The next step. What is
the
the next step in this moment? Right.
cultivating what's growing now.
Right.
Because we can grow that stuff really well. If we can grow the restorative justice and the sharing economies and the commons-based work and the anarchical systems of governance that kind of bring people together to self-govern in all sorts of different ways, and the urban agriculture that sustains people, and community-based energy systems, all of this stuff, if we can grow that really, really intensely and cultivate healthy soil so that it can grow and grow and grow and grow, that becomes what happens next. But it only becomes because we've been focusing on here,
Mm.
not there.
Yeah. You got me thinking about the Peter Wohlleben book, The Secret Life
Yeah,
of Trees.
yeah.
Yeah. And I love
Yes,
the
I
way
love
you use the cultivation. Yeah, I love the way you use the cultivation word so much too, in the social space. And I like in that book the way he creates a lot of metaphors as well with the way in the healthy forest ecosystem. You have these huge elder trees, and they
Right.
take up so much space and create so much shade that the young trees can only grow at a certain pace. And they have to wait for that elder tree to lose a big limb, and then someone can take an opportunity. But they're all connected at the roots, so everyone's helping each other survive on that level. Whereas when you clear cut and you just plant all the same trees a certain distance apart, they all just maniacally race for light in this competitive. So I like the way you talk about that. If we shift some of these spaces and what we cultivate in these systems, we actually socially change the way we are in those environments, right?
Right, right. And of course, the dead and dying trees are an incredibly important part of the ecosystem as well.
Mm-hmm.
Here in Australia, so much of our wildlife, our birds and our smaller marsupials can only survive in the hollows of dead and dying trees. Um, and as you say, it's falling limbs which create the space for the next tree to start growing. So
Mm-hmm.
it's that's part of the embracing of discomfort too. Our our modern world is terrified of death,
Yes, yes.
and we need to learn not to be. I don't know. Yeah, it's difficult, but we need to learn not to be.
Well, I mean, we could talk about that. Is there something that you've experienced that has helped you make space for that in your own life or confront any fear of death that you have carried?
Um, that's a very big question as well. I think when I think about it right now, I'm thinking about my grandmother who I absolutely adored and lived to the ripe old age of almost 90. Um, she was just an immensely loving person. She was a Holocaust survivor. She'd been through so much.
Mhm.
And her philosophy of life basically, as she certainly articulated it to me when I was a young parent, was when things are difficult, love even harder every time. If the kids are annoying the hell out of you, go and give them a really big cuddle and love them even harder.
Mm.
Um, and she left us almost 9 years ago,
Mm.
and she's with me every day.
Yeah,
Every day she is with me.
beautiful.
She's here.
Yeah,
I think about her all the time. I think about her lessons and I talk to her.
she's a real ancestor for you. That's beautiful. Yeah. It's rare to have someone that we can point to as a real elder like that. It's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Um, it's interesting for me. I grew up with a lot of trauma in my own experience and then intergenerational trauma in the family. And it's almost like I was experiencing death multiple times a day in this sense of feeling so existentially unsafe in my body because I was being abused, unsafe in my environment because people weren't protecting me. So, um, I reached a point where when I was an adult, I sort of went, I actually am too used to some of that. I'm too used to being able to sit with this like high level of adrenaline or in some of these crises spaces, and I actually need to protect myself better now. I need to not put myself in those spaces unless I'm being mindful about it. Um, I was working in South Africa in some remote communities with some rural Zulu populations, and it was really heartwarming community-based work, and we were doing some great stuff, bringing some kids together to do preschool work and teaching some of the women to get preschool certifications. We're building community veggie gardens so they could eat a bit healthier. We did these movie nights, um, where, where like everyone of every age would come, and we'd set up a generator in this mud brick church and project a kids movie on the screen and sell popcorn. It was really beautiful. However, the actual environmental context for them engaging socially with the people who were above me, running a large organization at the game reserve, was really fraught, and there was still a lot of system issues and racism in the systems, and
Mm.
um, they ended up doing union striking, and it got a little violent. And I was talking to a friend on the phone during that time when I was there, and she was amazingly peaceful with me about it when she said, "Is this your struggle? Are you prepared to die for them? Because that's what's happening right now. People are dying around you." And it was true. People were dying or getting death threats. Somebody had been killed. Like, it was getting really rough. And that for me was a real moment of wake up call, I suppose, from not recognizing enough fear of death or enough valuing of my being, and sort of going, no, actually, this is not what I'm going to live or die for. I really love and care about these people, but I don't feel that about this struggle at this time in my life. So, I had to start making plans to physically leave and try to leave them in some kind of a
Yeah.
decent state, as respectfully as I could. And they gave me a beautiful send off, and um,
Yeah.
they understood. Although they did offer to pay a bride price and send my parents hundreds of cows if I would stay.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. No, look, that's very powerful, and thank you for sharing that with me. And I guess what to me, what that one of the one of the kind of the I guess the philosophizing around that very pragmatic, practical story for me would be that I think one of the things that goes hand in hand with our culture's fear of death is, ironically, a lack of valuing of life and the extraordinary value that life holds. And somehow for me, letting go a little bit of the fear of death enables us to actually value life itself a bit more too.
yes,
And so what you're saying is, yes, too much fear of death, too little fear of death
that's right. Is a
means you
devaluing of
devalue life.
life.
Yeah.
I feel like
So
I was the other side of the extreme. It was like everyone around me was so scared of death, they didn't want to look at things, and then I ended up sort of sucking in the opposite energy.
right.
But yeah,
Mhm.
um,
Yeah, so yeah, that's partly it's that kind of thinking, in fact, is what led me to call my book Living Democracy.
mm,
And it's about this idea that, you know, um, our systems are kind of deadening in so many ways.
mm,
We see that so obviously with the devaluing of ecologies and ecosystems, most obviously in terms of the climate crisis, which could send all of us extinct, but with biodiversity crises and so much, there's a, you know, the mighty dollar is so much more important than living systems around us, which are what give us life. The whole economic narrative is kind of anti-life, but our
yes, I
democratic
agree.
systems are deadening as well. Our democratic systems are kind of all about these kind of
Mm.
carved in stone institutions, which are clearly kind of crumbling, but we insist on keeping them carved in stone instead of kind of going, they're living systems too, because all they are is kind of the extension of us and our ecosystems. We need to live our democracies. If they're not living and if we're not living them, then they're dead.
That made me think of two things. One is this quick story, and one was a question for you. The quick story is I'll put it in the comments. I can't think of the name of the author at the minute, but there's a woman in Melbourne who did a PhD on Stonehenge, and she worked alongside a number of traditional custodians, and she puts forward a very convincing narrative that Stonehenge is actually an indigenous knowledge placeholder, that people had left um, traditional lands, and or their traditional lands had physically altered to the extent that they built these huge monolithic structures in a particular way to preserve certain knowledges, and then continue to do ceremonies there for quite a long time and pass that on so that they could preserve that knowledge. And that really resonated with me. when
Mm,
I read about her work.
mm.
But that when you're talking about the stones and the monoliths, then I was thinking, but even then, even though they put that in the stones and monoliths, we still collectively have lost that knowledge. Like we can't work out, it's still not embedded in the land. It still was abstracted enough that now we can't get to it anymore. And it got me thinking, so if you're looking at things now in certain systems and then what certain people are representing in those systems, certain values that they're embodying. So let's look at in my country, you've got Donald Trump embodying quite a lot of values that I have conflict with, for example, that I would consider are not life affirming visions of us moving forward in the way he leads. I would love to hear if you have a perspective on like the tree that's fallen down and creates an environment, sort of metaphorically, with some of those systems and people embodying some of maybe those older values, how you see that as part of the cycle and part of this birth, life, death, rebirth, and see the positive, like that creates an ecosystem. Do you know what I mean? Do you have a response to that question?
Keep asking these very big questions. Don't you? Look, where my brain wants to go with this, and I'm not sure whether that's what you were getting at, but riffing off what I was hearing, um, I think governing systems go through cycles in the same way that everything else does.
Mm.
Um, this wonderful book, David Graeber's last book with David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything, kind of explores a deep history of that, of how, as they put it, human history is so much more full of playful possibilities of different ways of being and governing ourselves than we can possibly imagine. And they tend to go through cycles. And what often tends to happen is that they are quite dispersed, quite grassroots, quite horizontalist
Yeah.
systems that sometimes somehow become more hierarchical and more coercive, more top-down governing systems. And they last for a while, and then usually they collapse quite quickly because those hierarchical structures are not actually very steady. They're
And
not
too
very,
rigid. Yeah.
they're too rigid, exactly. They're too rigid and they collapse under their own pressure.
Yeah.
And we see that throughout even recorded, history, modern history going back to the Romans, as you might want to think of it. Actually, we see kind of these, the rise of empires, the collapse of empires, and then our kind of still somewhat imperial system likes to call the periods in between that dark ages, but actually they're periods of time where governance is much more distributed, governance is much more horizontalist.
Mm.
Even kind of interestingly enough, even feudal systems are actually much more horizontalist
Mm.
than what we tend to see. Because yes, there's somebody who's kind of in control, but the people underneath are also in control of their own lives. I think what's happening at the moment is our systems become incredibly hierarchical, incredibly coercive, even if we don't necessarily see it as much as such. And Donald Trump is kind of the archetype of that, isn't
Mm.
he?
Mm.
As the wannabe autocrat
Mm.
who wants to take control again of the levers of power of the most militarily powerful, coercive, economically powerful
Yes.
country
Bully of a
ever
country.
existed.
The US is a bully of a country. Yes, yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In everything, in its entire structures. And I think what that is symbolic of is that these structures are coming to their logical conclusion and they're starting to buckle under their own weight.
Mm.
I suspect actually now that this will be delayed a little bit because I think Kamala Harris is very likely to win, and so that collapse is possibly pushed a little bit further away in the same way that the way the French left managed to band together to keep out the extreme right has
And yes.
delayed it a little bit, probably not for very long.
Mm.
Um, I think we're reaching these points where these hierarchical systems are coming to their logical conclusion and they're going to start to collapse. They already are collapsing. The institutions aren't really working anymore. That's why we're getting to this point of people heading towards autocracy, because the systems of governance that kind of should be about, systems of governance essentially are about conflict resolution. They're about conflict management.
Mhm.
And instead of being resolving conflicts, dealing with conflicts well, increasingly they're letting these conflicts simmer and then explode, and then simmer and then explode, and simmer and explode time and time again. So they're not doing their job. They're failing abysmally. And so that's, I guess, yeah, the riff where I would take that with this whole Donald Trump question is I think Trump will fizzle out now, but the reason he exploded in the first place will not go away.
Yes.
And these concentrated hierarchical coercive systems will continue to crumble. And so what comes next is eventually going to be, again, a much more distributed system of power and a much more horizontalist system of power. The question is, will we get will we be able to get there before horrible
Too much destruction that's
comes
to come
first?
back from. Yeah. No, it's very interesting what you're saying, and it just makes me think about reflections on, I mean, governance at its has obviously a lot of values and spirituality underlying it. And for me, then I go to sovereignty. And one of the main distinctions with the current systems we're talking about and an Indigenous science-based system is sovereignty is considered from the ground up in Indigenous science. So you can only be sovereign on the land you're on. Um, and sovereignty in the other system is top down. I can come here on a boat and plant a flag and say it's mine, right? So that's
Mm,
innately um, destructive from an Indigenous science perspective because you can't top down it. That's not the nature of sovereignty in that sort of a worldview. And then when I think about um, the US for me, I reached a point where I felt like the the major sort of governance innovation that the founding men had there coming from England was you could be a materially wealthy white male and you could get absolutely to the heights socially and you didn't have to be born in a particular lineage. In England, you just reached ceilings if you just weren't born in a particular family, right? You just couldn't get ahead. Whereas they made this slightly different in the US. You could absolutely get to the top, no matter if how you were born, as long as you started accumulating wealth and behaving in a certain way. And to me, I sort of was like, okay, that was the innovation. And I see where that actually was a big deal socially for its time. And I see where people have since tried to broaden and expand that to be more inclusive. So it's not just white men. Any of you can go own land and build up your fortune. And yeah, we'll create scholarships for, those of you who don't have families that help you get into these particular powerful universities to help some of you enter and etc. Obama still went to Harvard, Clinton went to Yale. Like it's still the same path. We've broadened a little bit who is allowed on it.
mm,
But for me, I just feel like at the foundation, it's just not enough. And that's what I sort of mean about playing around the edges. I reached a point for myself spiritually where I went, I don't feel like I I can keep putting life force in like full-time work in these social like public spaces because it feels too dispiriting the pace at which change could occur. I feel like I need to be doing something
mm,
that's more humble and grounded, even if it starts just a few hours a week and I sort of grow it so that ultimately I'm toggling between doing some stuff that maybe a lot of people would consider really fringe and um even strange, and just alien to them, where I'm like, I'm trying to create spaces where people can experience something completely different.
Mm.
And so for me, that's done a lot through ceremony, and that's something I've experienced with some Indigenous knowledge holders who've invited me into their ceremonies. And then I've sometimes spent like a decade trying to integrate what I learned and embody it in my daily life, step by step by step. Like, okay, this was a particular moment where I felt in such a clear, pure way that the earth loved me and wanted me. I don't feel that often. How do I then bring that feeling and that experience into my daily life so that I can walk around day to day and like cultivate that feeling? Because I feel like for me and for plenty of others who've been on the devaluing life side,
Mm.
that's the healing, is feeling that sense of, no, the earth wants me here and I'm valuable. And even if other people can't sort of see me or value some of my gifts, or they don't want to go and sit in some of the pain that I've been in, some people do, and they can try to find me. Some people, I just have trust and faith, more and more will be like, yes, you've put words to what I'm going through, right? So that's more been my feeling about it, was like, it was literally just burning me out too much to be in the public space. So
Yeah.
ways I coped, and I'm interested in hearing from you. Um, like when I'm in a city, I I almost exclusively play nature sounds in the house. Um, I I do a lot of walking around barefoot. I wear grounding shoes in buildings. I do a lot of meditating to sort of clear some energy. If I'm near like you talked about Canberra, which is a city that has so many beautiful parks, like I make an effort to go out to parks or wilderness, or the beach or whatever is available in that place. Um, but I still just find it on all levels, spiritual, emotional, psychological, physical, a real struggle to just be really in my body and feel grounded and centered when I'm in a city. It feels really hard. So I'm interested in part of
Mm.
how you do that, especially as you're going into really intense spaces when you're talking about federal government. I mean, the level of mind games going on in those spaces is really extreme.
Yeah. Um, it's it is really it is really hard. Um, because you're constantly kind of in this tension, juggling back and forth, um, toggling back and forth between living in the world as it is, um, living in the world we wanted to be, and living in the world as it is, kind of also elsewhere. And I do similar things to you. I've always walked around barefoot. In fact, even when I was a staffer in Parliament House, walking around the corridors barefoot, people used to laugh at me. There's that bloody greeny guy who's walking around barefoot in Parliament House, um, with
Yeah.
hair down to my waist at that stage too. Um, but they took me seriously, which was interesting because people said they wouldn't, but they did still.
Mm,
Um, spend a lot of time in nature. And this is, yeah, there's an incredible privilege to living in a city like Canberra where my house is 10 minutes bike ride from the center of town from the university.
mhm,
Um, and we're surrounded by trees, and I've seen 7 different species of parrot alone in our garden. We've got little spotted pardalotes, these tiny, gorgeous little jewel of a bird that often nest in our garden. Um, shingleback lizards and blue tongues, um, and we let our garden grow wild, full of native plants. And it's on a suburban street, and sometimes people raise their eyebrows, but then you can see them sometimes stopping and looking at the fact that we have gangs and pardalotes and things, and they appreciate that. And I think that's, to me, one of the things that I think we really need to think about with city life, because cities aren't going away. they can't go away. Cities are going to be part of human culture from here on in, however long it lasts. And I think one of the problems we have, it's like this kind of life death binary. In our binary world, we kind of think, well, city is not nature.
Everything is nature. Absolutely
Everything
everything.
is nature. Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Everything. And this was an insight that was brought to me actually by, there was a wonderful series at the ANU of seminars on human ecology a number of years ago that I went to. And one of the people there in one of the early seminars I went to said, well, cities are as much nature as a beaver's dam is nature, or a wombat's burrow is nature. We are part of nature, and we
And we
construct
built
this.
this. That's right. Yeah.
But we've constructed these habitats a lot of the time in a way that deadens. Again, it shuts out life. It shuts out life systems, and we build these bloody concrete boxes, and with metal lining and glass, and it doesn't have to be that way. We can build green walls, we can build green roofs, we can bring plant life and animal life into the city. We can live in close proximity to each other. And there's a lot of benefits that come with living in very close proximity to each other.
Mm,
We share ideas. We can govern ourselves reasonably easily when
mm,
we have large numbers of people living in close proximity.
mm.
The problem is we live in close proximity and we pretend that we're disconnected individuals when we're not.
Yeah.
We're interdependent, entwined, and tangled ecosystems. Um, and so my belief is that if we start to do this kind of thing, this again, it feels like it's at the edges, but if we can start doing urban agriculture and urban, tree plantings and greenings and green walls and all of this kind of stuff, it brings life into a deadened world, and it brings joy. It brings connectedness. It brings transcendence. Um, all of these things that are suppressed by the way we've constructed our cities and our governing systems and our economic systems. Um, and yeah, it's doing these little things that feel a bit dinky and can
Yeah.
be rubbished as a bit dinky, but they're not. They're actually really
They
these.
really can intervene. I do agree with you.
Yeah,
Oh,
and I think it's really important to kind of hold on to that.
just as you said that, this bowerbird flew by and she had this blue bottle lid in her.
Ah, yeah, I had a satin bowerbird just out here in the front yard just the other day. Yeah, gorgeous.
Um, yeah. What did they find that was blue before all of our plastic?
Maybe they like it now because it's unusual and they hadn't seen it before.
Yeah, maybe it was something else. They had flowers they collected or
Right.
something.
Little
Seashell.
butterflies. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, how do you sit with that I mean, it hasn't happened in Australia to my knowledge, but in a number of countries there's this idea of talking about pushing around the edges of creating legal status for
Mm.
landforms or trees or rivers or even particular species. I mean,
Mm.
here, I feel like it's always this angle of finding some endangered species and saying, well, you can't build or do this here because of this, because that's the way the laws are structured right now. That's just what you have to work with in that space, right? Rather than actually maybe making the arguments you want to be able to
Mm.
make. So I was just interested in you talking a bit about that and your vision of
Mm.
democracy in a broad sense, expanding to the non-human, the way we think about it.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that idea. I've written a bit around that idea of rights of nature and the natural world. Um, I I like to think of it in its broadest terms rather than, yeah, as you say, the tendency has been certainly more recently to kind of make it particular ecological beings like the Whanganui River in New Zealand, for instance, or there's been talk about the Great Barrier Reef, giving that kind of legal rights. And that's useful too. That's very interesting. I think one of the things it does, I'm always interested in ways of bringing something in through the existing kind of structures that by doing that, it challenges the basis of the structure.
Yes.
And that I think is one of the things that Rights for Nature does. Rights are conceived of as human, unless they're corporate. There's a lot of corporate rights too, of course,
Right.
but they're human rights and they rest in the individual. Um, and one of the things that Rights for Nature does is it challenges both the humanity of rights, but it also challenges the individuality of rights. And
Yes.
it starts to say these are collective ecological rights that are much broader than us, much bigger than us. And it starts to, as you were saying, it starts to flip it back into that indigenous idea that the rights are vested in the land.
Mm-hmm.
Sovereignty is in the land. The land, as the wonderful, beautiful Mary Graham, who's an adjunct professor, Quandamooka and Waka Waka woman up in South Queensland, she puts it so clearly in terms of the law is the land.
Mm-hmm.
Country owns us,
Mm-hmm.
not the other way around. And once we start to think of the law is the land, then fundamentally rights are vested in country.
Mm-hmm.
Rights are vested in the ecosystems themselves. And our little individualist human rights kind of just, yeah, they're pretty small in comparison, frankly.
It should be a pretty small framework. That actually a much larger framework is how do we be stewards of the land for on behalf of all of us to be able to live there, but on behalf of all of other beings, how do we what is to
Hmm.
me it starts to come down to like what is actually our responsibility as humans on this planet in a spiritual sense, and to me that's to steward. So why are we here? We love picking apart ecosystems and sort of going, well, this one feeds this one, does this one, and it's like, well, what is something we can do that other beings can't do? Well, we can do burning of the land in such a way that other beings can't do. We can dig and move certain things around in a way that some other beings can't do. Um, and it's interesting, and I feel like that knowledge is potentially the strongest among Aboriginal Australians than even other Indigenous peoples on the planet. Um, this the depth of time and connection that the people have had on these lands, and um,
Hmm.
the the knowing on such a deep fundamental level that they are the ecosystem, not even our Western language of being part of it, but being are it, right? In that being sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an incredible depth there that we have so much to learn from. And I think, yeah, just as you were talking then, one of the things that occurred to me about that, what I've learned that kind of connects us back in a sense to what we've been talking about of feeling like we're tinkering around the edges if we're doing one small thing.
Mm,
In the Australian Aboriginal understanding, yes, the land is the law, the country owns us, but it's not any one individual person or even group's job to look after it all.
mm, mm-hmm,
And so you have totem species, for
mm,
instance, that you have a stewardship, familial stewardship relationship with. And
mm,
so it's your responsibility. Sometimes it's species, sometimes it's an animal, sometimes it's a river bend or something like that. But it's your responsibility to look after this and to speak for it.
mm-hmm.
And so when you have yarning circles, when decisions are being made collectively, um, it's not everyone's role to speak for everything. It's not
Yes.
everyone's role to do everything. That's kind of
Yes.
quite Western way of thinking
Yes,
about
I
it.
agree. Yes.
So you get through the indigenous knowledges, you get this idea that we steward the whole ecosystem by giving each of us certain responsibilities of stewardship within that.
Right. And recognizing that we are in the ecosystem and it is okay for us to take a bit of land to plant food that we will eat because we also need to survive. At some point that feels not okay when we're taking so much of it that other beings can't survive, right? There are these balance points.
Right.
Because sometimes I feel like the Western mind wants to write us out of the spaces.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm quite troubled by, this it certainly used to be the case. I don't think it is mainstream anymore in environmentalism, but certainly kind of the early 20th century US environmentalism, Audubon and folks, it was all about wilderness and keeping humanity out of the wilderness, making national parks that we kind of closed off. I don't think most environmentalism is that anymore. There's still a conception of it as such, though, and you still get things like, Edward O. Wilson, who, all respect, he was a tremendous scientist and brought so much wisdom to us, but his last work around the half Earth idea that we need to actually close off half of the planet that we shouldn't access, I think was wrong,
Mm,
and problematic. I think we need to do the opposite. Like I was saying, we need to bring ecosystems into our cities. We need to
yes,
learn how to do agriculture in ways which is also ecosystems, and also power stations, solar power
yes.
with agriculture, with housing, all of these things, blurring these boundaries rather than closing off, pretending we're separate from.
I think too, it's helpful for me to keep holding that um uncertainty of we might take another step and start moving collectively towards living in a way that feels better. And then we might sit in a stasis with that for a little while and then feel that nudge and that urge again, like this still isn't good enough, but it actually was a lot of work to get to this point, right? So we need to tinker around the edges more and keep picking away at it. Because for me, when you talk about people's thinking around like, I mean, still today, like I was saying to you when we talked the first time, I worked with a number of Aboriginal land councils some years ago, and
Mm.
their very real practical struggle when they get land title returned to them is often if you want to really protect it, you have to turn it into national parks still. And that means they can't live there, and the tourism opportunities for them to create income are quite limited. But if they don't turn it to national park, then that has a lot of other risks, and they can't necessarily physically manage some of the land that they have title to, and etc. So
Well, they
um,
have to spend money on
it's
it.
still a real physical struggle. Yeah, if that's the best way to practically protect it, and then they're pushing around the edges saying, well, we want to at least do ceremony and do this and this here. We don't want people to access this, but we can't force them not to. So we have to put up a sign and tell them, please don't do this thing on this spot, you know? So it's quite tricky.
Mm.
Um, but it gets me thinking about the way we see human nature. And when I look at the way I was partially raised in the Judeo-Christian model and growing up in the South in the US, um, there was like such a huge conversation around sin and the sense of humans by our nature having something's either wrong with us or um, being untrustworthy, like the sense that we are sort of inherently destructive or a bit bad and that we're always recovering from that was
Mm.
how a lot of people in my cultural context growing up saw the nature of our species.
Mm.
And when that is how you see yourself and your fellow beings, then I understand the sensibility of saying we've got to protect the rest of the planet from us. There's something wrong with us. We're bad, right? So for me, a lot of the work in the the space I'm in is supporting unpacking of that. You know, where did that idea come from? Do you still need that belief? You know, is that really how you, even if that's just how you've always seen yourself, is that how you want to? You know, is there an empowered moment where you could go, even just maybe that's not the nature of humans, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's really noticeable is that idea of original sin informs capitalism in an extremely deep way, because capitalism is based on the idea that all humans are inherently fundamentally selfish.
Yes.
And what we need to do is somehow structure an economic system that takes advantage of that selfishness. Um, and yeah, what I think we need to do is build these practical projects that help people live into being this understanding that actually humans are, yeah, of course there's selfishness in us that,
We
but
all have
we're also
capacity.
fundamentally cooperative
Mm,
people.
yeah.
Um, and we're fundamentally entangled, and we get so much of our love and our joy from that entanglement. Um, and yeah, what we need to do is build systems that actually support our best instincts, support us to cooperate and thrive together. Um, and yeah, it's unlearning. It's a really hard task to unlearn that deeply embedded idea of selfishness, of original sin. Um, it's been so deeply inculcated into us through our culture for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
it's
and
been a,
for me it disconnects us from parts of ourselves, what I would consider our nature, but also just from the earth in general, because
mm,
there's this sense
mm,
of a lack of worth
yeah,
almost. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Um, well, I'm just interested if something else is coming to you now that we haven't touched on, that you just feel like needs to be part of this conversation. Um,
Just as a final observation, something that yeah that I touched on just then in terms of kind of the living into being and the practical that also comes out of this idea of kind of working around the edges. I think in change making, I don't know if you had this experience too, but in so much of our work in the modern world, we've been told to believe that behavior follows belief, and that if we can change people's minds about something, then we can change their behavior out of it.
hmm,
And I think what we're learning from so many different fields interweaving um, is that it actually tends to go the opposite way.
hmm,
And if we can change people's behavior,
hmm,
then it'll change their mind,
hmm.
and then that reinforces in that direction. So I guess yeah, what I'm thinking of is things like sharing groups and repair cafes and community gardens and things like that that people get involved in because it kind of almost comes to your point about ceremony as well. Like there's a ceremony to it. There's a there's a connection, there's a transcendence to doing stuff together that we know is good for us and is also good for the common good. And we just start doing it. And the more we do it, the more we kind of go, oh, that's really cool. I want to do that more.
Hmm.
And then we start to believe it. And you can believe it much more easily by doing it than you do it because you believe it. Things like participatory democracy is
Yeah.
such a prime example for me. Citizens' assemblies and kitchen table conversations and things like that. If I talk to somebody, on the street or somebody I know about the idea of participatory democracy, getting communities together to talk about stuff and finding answers together,
Yeah.
if you haven't had an experience of it, you don't believe it.
Hmm.
Haven't done it yourself, it is virtually impossible to convince people that that's a better way of making decisions than electing somebody to go off and sit in parliament and decide for it.
Giving that power to that person, right? Yep.
But once you've done it, you can never unlearn it.
Right.
Once you've been part of a deliberative participatory conversation, you can never not believe that it works again.
Hmm.
So I guess that to me is a final little observation that actually it's this process of living into being the world that we want rather than convincing people of this vision. We just got to live it. We've got to do it ourselves. And when we do it, people will come along with it because they'll believe it.
Yeah, I really like what you're closing with, and I think for me, it just helps with orientation. Like part of us each doing the work is finding where we need to be, what space feels like the most appropriate for us to cultivate. And my husband and I talk about it sometimes as um like parts of a long bridge or links in a chain or something, and sort of going, well, my capacity is not the best in this space. I get overwhelmed, I get triggered, I whatever it is, right? But my capacity is actually over here. But I really like working with this person and they're amazing in that space. So
Right.
they'll link, there.
Yeah.
I
Right.
will just work with
Yeah.
them and they'll be their strength over there. So yeah, so part of it for me is each of us, as you said earlier, my perspective in Indigenous science is wherever we live now, we have those totemic connections, and we may or may not be practically aware of it. It may take quite some time to connect to the land in depth and, sort of sit in a spot and really be in that space and get that insight for ourselves or not. Some people may just know, for some reason, I've always had this feeling like I'm drawn to this animal or this plant or whatever it is, or this particular place, and I go there all the time. And I would fight for that if anyone tried to take that park away. Some people may know that already. Um, but I feel like we have that, and it's about creating that awareness. Whether you realize a particular totem or not, it's sort of saying to yourself, well, like, what's my placement? Where am I best placed in this collective struggle? And I feel like when that's the focus, it helps with moments of overwhelm where for I can go, well, I'm doing these and these things, and I'm still using way more plastic than I would prefer to, but I've got this friend doing zero waste, and that's her struggle. And when I'm ready and I
Hmm.
have more capacity to
Right.
let have less plastic flowing through my life,
Yeah.
then she's going to have so much knowledge, and some of it
Right.
I'll go, that's too hard. I can't practically do that. You do that as like a full-time job because you feel that need to do
Mm.
that to such a degree that I really admire, but I'm never going to do it to that degree, right? So it's recognizing where we're best placed, and I think for myself as well, it's trying to have a lot of compassion. So when I think about a Donald Trump figure, um, I think, wow, I don't envy you and your karma, for lack of a better word. You've taken on a lot collectively. The amount of projections that people put onto him and the energy he's riding is just a lot to humanly be with. I don't think my body and mind could handle it. Um, so
Clearly, such an unhappy man.
I mean, it's actually his capacity is so impressive. Um, I remember years ago someone talking about another Holocaust memoir to sort of come full circle and saying that this woman she saw give a talk said that Hitler had so much capacity to carry so much negativity and hatred and anger and etc. Um, that it was actually such an amazing gift to have that much brought to the surface, and it may take many, 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 many generations. And as an individual soul, that her perspective was that he, as a soul, was sacrificing himself so that basically the entire planet could learn what not to do in an extreme way. Um, and I found that so beautiful that this, especially a particular, her context that she'd been a Holocaust survivor, that she'd come to that perspective on
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Um,
The
so I,
compassion.
yeah, so I try to, you can't force yourself to go to these depths, but I just try to remind myself and sit there and say, um, I have to just keep finding compassion for what we're destroying and for our, I will say, innocent ignorance collectively, because we are taught things that are not necessarily life affirming, and it takes a lot of work to
Yeah.
unravel it. Yeah. And I feel privileged that I have had enough capacity and space to see through it. And some people are so busy surviving that they just won't get that space. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I feel privileged to have the capacity to have conversations like this with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Tim. And if people want to read your book and learn more about what you're doing, could you just briefly tell them how to do it? And then I'll pop it in the notes as well below.
Sure. My book is called Living Democracy, an ecological manifesto for the end of the world as we know it. And I'm also privileged to have a very unusual name, Tim Hollo, without a W. If you Google me, you can find me. Um, and you can find the Green Institute's website too, with a whole lot of my other writing and work and webinars that we do. We're starting a series on peace and nonviolence now, and yeah, look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's been lovely.
Excellent.